When little Emma grabbed the grocery store clerk's hand and drew on it, Daniel smiled kindly. Everyone thought she was just playing, but she'd drawn the exact symbol from his military tattoo, the one hidden under his sleeve, and her silent gesture would reveal why the billionaire's daughter never spoke. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Daniel Morgan stood in aisle 7 of the neighborhood grocery store, his worn hands arranging cans of soup with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from doing the same task 6 days a week for the past 2 years. The winter cold seeped through the automatic doors each time they slid open, bringing with it the smell of exhaust and the reality of another long shift ahead. He was 34 years old but felt decades older. The kind of tired that sleep could not cure. The kind that settled into bones and made a home there. His long-sleeved shirt, carefully chosen that morning as it was every morning, covered the stories he tried to forget. The ink that marked a life before this one, before grocery aisles and overdue bills and medical appointments that filled his calendar like prayers. Beneath the fabric on his left forearm lived a symbol most people would not recognize. An ancient Sumerian mark meaning guardian, etched into his skin during his final deployment, when he still believed he could save everyone, when he still believed good intentions mattered more than outcomes. That was 3 years ago in a place that felt like another lifetime, in a hospital that no longer existed, surrounded by people whose faces visited him in dreams he wished he could forget. The tattoo remained hidden always, covered by cotton and shame, a reminder of promises he could not keep, and a woman who begged him to tell her daughter she loved her before the light left her eyes. Now his life was smaller, contained within these fluorescent-lit aisles and a cramped 2-bedroom apartment where his daughter Mia waited with Mrs. Chen from next door, 8 years old, and fighting leukemia with more courage than he could summon most days. The apartment walls were covered with Mia's colorful drawings, cheerful crayon creations that hid the peeling paint beneath and made the place feel less like poverty and more like hope. 3 medical bills sat overdue in his wallet next to a rent notice he had been avoiding for 2 weeks. But his smile never wavered when customers approached. His kindness cost nothing, and he gave it freely to everyone who crossed his path. He worked double shifts 6 days a week. Every dollar counted twice before spent, medical appointments scheduled around his manager's goodwill, and the charity of neighbors who watched Mia when he could not afford childcare. The guilt lived in him like a second heartbeat, steady and relentless. The memories of that December day in Syria when the hospital collapsed and he pulled 6 people from the rubble but could not save the one who mattered most, the surgeon who showed him photos of her daughter and talked about the guardian patches their unit wore and made him promise things he did not have the courage to fulfill. He hummed softly while he worked, a children's song Mia loved, something about sunshine and rainbows, and tried not to think about the test results they were waiting for, or the experimental treatment they could not afford, or the way his daughter's smile had grown dimmer as the treatments grew harsher. Across the city, in a penthouse that overlooked everything and touched nothing, William Carter stared at his reflection in floor-to-ceiling windows and saw a man who had conquered industries but lost his family. At 42, he had built a tech empire that changed how the world communicated, made billions that meant less than nothing, surrounded himself with art and marble and silence that echoed like accusation. His daughter Emma was 6 years old and had not spoken a single word in 3 years, not since the day her mother died in a bombing half a world away, not since the video call went dark mid-sentence and took all the light from their lives with it. Dr. Sarah Carter had been brilliant and compassionate and stubborn. A surgeon who volunteered for humanitarian missions despite the danger, who believed some things mattered more than safety or comfort or quarterly earnings reports. William had been in a board meeting when she called that final time, let it go to voicemail while discussing profit margins. Never imagined that silence would be the last conversation they would never have. Emma clutched a worn stuffed rabbit everywhere she went, drew constantly in sketchbooks she shared with no one, communicated through nods and headshakes and drawings that William could not interpret no matter how desperately he tried. The penthouse was museum perfect. every surface gleaming with expensive emptiness, Emma's room filled with toys that went untouched because what she wanted could not be bought in stores or ordered online or solved with money. William had hired every specialist and therapist and expert he could find, flew them in from around the world, tried experimental treatments and traditional approaches and everything in between, but nothing broke through the wall his daughter had built around herself. The doctors called it selective mutism, triggered by severe trauma, explained that she could speak but chose not to, that her silence was protection against a pain too large to process. William understood. He had built his own walls, thrown himself into work instead of grief, let board meetings and acquisitions fill the space where his wife and daughter used to fit. His assistant Rebecca had suggested something different that morning, her voice gentle with the kind of pity he had grown to resent. Perhaps normal activities might help Mr. Carter. Perhaps a regular grocery store instead of having everything delivered. Perhaps ordinary life might spark something conventional treatment could not. He agreed reluctantly, more from desperation than belief, and drove Emma to a neighborhood market far from their wealthy enclave, a place where real people did real shopping and nothing cost more than $20. The black luxury sedan looked absurd in the modest parking lot, drawing stares from people loading groceries into dented cars. But Emma did not seem to notice. She rarely noticed anything beyond her internal world of silence and symbols. Her purple coat stood stark against the gray winter afternoon as William helped her out, watched her clutch her rabbit and sketchbook like lifelines, led her through automatic doors into a world of fluorescent lights and handwritten price signs and the everyday struggles of people whose problems could not be solved by writing checks. Emma saw things others missed. That was her gift and her curse. She noticed the way light caught dust motes and made them dance like stars, how people's hands told stories their mouths tried to hide, how sadness wore different faces but always carried the same weight in the shoulders. She wandered away from her father near the produce section, drawn by something she could not name, pulled by gravity she did not understand toward a man kneeling by the bottom shelf of aisle 7. Daniel was restocking cans of tomato sauce and humming that children's song, exhausted but present, his movements efficient and kind even in solitude. And something about him made Emma stop mid-step. She watched his hands, scarred and capable, working with gentle precision, and saw in them echoes of other hands, medical gloves covered in dust, fingers that moved quickly through rubble, the ghost of memory she could not quite grasp but knew was true. She approached silently. Adults never noticed small girls among shopping carts and weekend crowds, and reached out with her tiny hand to touch his wrist. Daniel looked up with a kind smile he gave everyone, assuming she was lost, his voice warm with concern as he said, "Hey there, sweetheart. Are you looking for your mom or dad?" Emma did not answer. Could not answer even if she wanted to. But she took his hand in both of hers with determined focus, pulled a marker from her pocket with the careful intention of someone on a mission 3 years in the making. She drew on his palm with precision that seemed impossible for a 6-year-old, tracing a symbol ancient and specific, her small face intense with concentration, as if the entire world depended on getting each line exactly right. Daniel felt his breath catch, his hand beginning to tremble, because the symbol she drew was identical to the one hidden beneath his sleeve, the Sumerian guardian mark he had carried from Syria, a coincidence too impossible to be coincidence at all. Time suspended in that grocery store aisle, fluorescent lights humming overhead, price tags bright with everyday promises, while Emma looked up at him with knowing eyes and tears began to form. The first real emotion she had shown anyone since the day the screen went dark. William appeared suddenly, rushing over with apologies and worry, his voice saying, "Emma, I am so sorry. She does not usually approach strangers. She does not." But the words died as Daniel rolled up his sleeve with shaking hands and revealed the identical symbol tattooed on his forearm. Military ink faded, but clear, undeniable proof that this was not random, not accident, not anything close to chance. William went pale, stared at the symbol, and his daughter's drawing and Daniel's face, his voice breaking as he asked, "Where did you get that tattoo and when?" and Daniel's answer came hollow with old pain. Syria, 3 years ago. I was Army medic attached to humanitarian mission. The grocery store sounds faded to nothing. Shopping carts and conversations and scanner beeps all disappearing as William's voice broke completely. His words tumbling out desperate and confused. My wife, doctor. Sarah Carter, she was in Syria 3 years ago. In December she died in. And Daniel finished the sentence for him. The hospital bombing December 14th. I was there. I tried to save everyone. I tried to save her. Emma made a sound then, small and broken. The first vocalization in 3 years, and she reached for Daniel's hand again, pressed it against her heart, as if confirming something she had always known. William's knees nearly buckled, his security detail stepping forward uncertain. And he asked the question that would change everything. You were with Sarah when she died. Daniel's tears came freely now. 3 years of grief spilling over in a grocery store aisle, his voice saying, she talked about her daughter constantly, about Emma. She made me promise to tell you she loved you. I could not find the courage to come forward. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Emma opened her sketchbook then, pages and pages of the guardian symbols surrounding drawings of a woman's face. Her mother's face repeated endlessly. A 3-year search for the person who tried to save her, the guardian who was there when the world ended. And suddenly everything made terrible, beautiful sense. 3 people stood frozen in that aisle, while other shoppers flowed around them like water around stones, strangers connected by tragedy and symbol, and the kind of loss that reshapes souls. And Daniel realized that sometimes the people we cannot save find us anyway, that sometimes failed promises get second chances, that sometimes grace arrives in the small hand of a silent child who draws hope on the palm of a broken man who thought his story of guardianship ended in rubble and regret, but was only just beginning. William insisted they go somewhere to talk, somewhere away from the fluorescent lights and curious shoppers, and within minutes they were sitting in a small coffee shop 3 blocks from the grocery store, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and local art on brick walls and prices that made William realize how disconnected he had become from ordinary life. He ordered something expensive and complicated before remembering this was not the kind of establishment that served $17 lattes, settled for plain black coffee that tasted bitter and honest, while Daniel sat across from him in the worn booth, looking profoundly uncomfortable. A man whose entire existence had been built on staying invisible, now thrust into the spotlight of scrutiny and wealth. Emma sat between them in a way that was not quite between. Her small body angled toward Daniel, her hand reaching out every few minutes to touch his wrist, as if confirming he was real and solid. And not another ghost her mind had conjured from grief and longing. She was drawing again, her marker moving across paper with unusual calm. The frantic energy that usually accompanied her art, replaced by something that looked almost like peace, and William realized he had not seen his daughter this settled in 3 years, had not seen her choose to be near someone rather than simply tolerating their presence. William's hands wrapped around the coffee cup for warmth or anchor, or something to hold on to as he asked the question that had been building since the grocery store. His voice raw and desperate. Tell me everything about that day. Everything about Sarah. Please. Daniel hesitated, his jaw working like he was chewing words he did not want to swallow, afraid to open wounds that had barely scabbed over, afraid to fail Sarah again by telling her story wrong. But then he looked at Emma and saw her eyes on him, trusting and needing and somehow already knowing. His voice came quiet and methodical. A medic's voice trained to stay calm during crisis, describing the humanitarian compound on the outskirts of Aleppo, the makeshift hospital that had once been a school, the way civilians flooded in daily seeking treatment for wounds both old and new. The smell of antiseptic trying to cover the smell of decay, the sound of children crying and adults praying, and generators struggling to keep the lights on. Sarah had arrived 2 weeks before the bombing with a medical team from an international aid organization, Daniel explained. Her reputation preceding her, a surgeon so skilled that other doctors spoke her name with reverence. But what struck him immediately was not her technical ability, but her fierce determination, the way she refused to leave patients even when danger escalated, the way she sang to frightened children during procedures and held the hands of dying strangers and made everyone around her believe that goodness could survive even in hell. Their unit had been assigned to provide security for the medical teams, Daniel continued. And he was specifically assigned to Dr. Carter's detail, which meant he spent those 2 weeks watching her work miracles with insufficient supplies and impossible odds. Watching her save lives that should have been lost, watching her transform a crumbling school into a sanctuary. The guardian symbol that Emma had drawn and that Daniel wore tattooed on his skin was featured on all their unit patches. He explained, a Sumerian mark meaning protector of the innocent, chosen by their commanding officer who believed symbols mattered, that they carried weight and intention and reminded soldiers what they were fighting for. Sarah had noticed the patches immediately, told Daniel the symbol reminded her of her daughter Emma, who loved ancient civilizations and had made her mother promise to bring home stories about the guardians who protected people, who stood between the innocent and the harm that sought to destroy them. During quiet moments between surgeries, Sarah would show Daniel photos on her phone, pictures of a bright-eyed child, always laughing, always moving, always full of questions and wonder, and Sarah's voice would transform when she spoke about Emma, warming with a love so pure it made Daniel ache for something he had never had, a family that felt like home instead of obligation. Sarah had confessed things to him during those long nights, waiting for the next wave of casualties, admitted her marriage felt hollow despite the mansion and the money and the appearance of success, that William was consumed by building his empire and had forgotten to build their family, that she had come to Syria partly to escape the emptiness of a life where everything looked perfect, but nothing felt real, that she needed to remember her purpose was saving lives, not attending charity galas where people pretended to care about causes they would forget by morning. She talked constantly about Emma's upcoming 6th birthday, the surprise party she was planning, the cake shaped like a castle, and the treasure hunt through their apartment, and the way Emma's face would light up with joy. And Sarah could not wait to go home, could not wait to hold her daughter and tell her about the children she had helped and the guardians who protected them and the symbol that meant someone always cared. December 14th arrived cold and tense, Daniel's voice growing quieter now, his hands clenched around the coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Intelligence warnings coming in about possible strikes in their area. Commands to evacuate non-essential personnel, but Sarah had 20 critical patients who could not be moved, children recovering from surgery and elderly civilians whose wounds would kill them without continued care. And she refused to leave, told the commanding officer she did not come to Syria to abandon people when they needed her most. Daniel had stayed as her security despite orders suggesting otherwise, showed her his guardian patch, and said the words that would haunt him forever. Guardian, remember, meaning he would protect her or die trying, not understanding that some promises are too large for any person to keep. The morning had gone well, surgery successful, the children's ward filling with laughter as Sarah entertained them with stories and songs, her gift for bringing light into darkness on full display, and Daniel remembered thinking that maybe the intelligence was wrong. Maybe they would all survive. Maybe goodness would win just this once. The warning came with 10 minutes' notice, sirens blaring, people scrambling to evacuate, chaos erupting as patients were carried toward basement shelters, but Sarah was mid-surgery on a 7-year-old boy whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. And she refused to leave him on the table, refused to let him die because she chose safety over completion. Daniel made the choice to stay with her, positioning himself between her and the window, his body a shield he hoped would be enough, both of them working frantically to finish the surgery, while the world outside descended into nightmare. The building shook when the first missile hit the northern wing, ceiling tiles falling, lights flickering, Sarah's hands never wavering as she tied off the final suture, and Daniel lifted the unconscious boy and started moving toward the door, just as the second impact struck directly above them. The ceiling collapsed in a cascade of concrete and rebar and dust that turned air into suffocation. Daniel throwing himself over 3 children who had been too weak to evacuate, his body covering theirs as debris rained down, and the world became noise and pain and the certainty of death. He did not know how long he lay there, could have been seconds or hours, time losing meaning in the darkness, but eventually he realized he was alive and the children beneath him were crying, which meant they were alive too. And he began the desperate work of pulling survivors from rubble. He found 6 people alive in the wreckage, carried them one by one to safety, while his hands bled and his back screamed and his lungs burned from dust and smoke. And then he found Sarah pinned beneath a concrete beam, her lower body crushed, still alive but fading fast, her eyes finding his with a clarity that broke him. Daniel knelt beside her and took her hand, her blood soaking into his uniform, his fingers intertwining with hers as she whispered the words he would carry forever. "Tell Emma I love her. Tell her the guardians tried. Tell her Mommy was not afraid." Sarah wore a medical bracelet with Emma's name engraved on it. Daniel explained to William and Emma, his voice barely audible now, and attached to the bracelet was a small charm in the shape of the guardian symbol, something Emma had made her mother promise to wear for protection, and as Sarah died, Daniel removed the bracelet and tucked it into his pocket like a sacred trust he did not deserve to carry. 12 people died that day, including Sarah. Daniel survived along with 6 others, and he brought home her bracelet, but could not find the courage to face her family, could not stand the thought of looking into William's eyes or Emma's eyes and admitting he had failed to keep his promise, that all his training and intention and desperate effort had not been enough. He left the military after that, tried to forget by becoming someone new, started over as a civilian in a grocery store where the stakes were small and the failures did not end in death, but the guilt followed him like a shadow. Every patient he could not save becoming Sarah again, every promise broken, echoing that final moment when her hand went still in his. William took over then, his turn to speak, his voice raw with 3 years of accumulated emotion, explaining what had happened to Emma in the aftermath of that December day, how his daughter had been on a tablet talking to Sarah before the bombing, a video call that had become routine during Sarah's deployment, Emma showing her mother drawings and talking about school and asking when Mommy would come home. Emma had watched her mother in the hospital, seen the guardian patches on the walls, heard the sounds of the compound, and then mid-sentence Sarah had disappeared, the screen going dark, the connection lost. Emma screaming for her mother while William tried desperately to get information, and nobody could explain what was happening or whether Sarah was alive or if their daughter had just witnessed her mother's death in real time. The trauma had been immediate and absolute. Emma stopped speaking that day. Doctors called it selective mutism, triggered by severe psychological trauma, explained that her mind was protecting itself by shutting down certain pathways, that she could physically speak but chose not to because words had failed her when she needed them most, because the last words she spoke to her mother had been followed by darkness and loss and a silence that swallowed everything. Emma drew the guardian symbol constantly after that. William explained, page after page after page, had seen it on the video calls, on the soldiers' uniforms, on patches visible in the background, and she became obsessed with it, trying to understand why the guardians could not save Mommy, why protection had failed, why symbols and promises and love had not been enough to keep the darkness away. Through her drawings, Emma was asking questions nobody could answer, seeking closure nobody could provide, needing someone who was there to tell her the truth about her mother's death, and William had failed her just as completely as he had failed Sarah. Withdrawing into work because he could not face Emma's pain without confronting his own, hiring an army of caregivers and therapists instead of being present, choosing the easier path of absence over the harder path of shared grief. The therapy sessions had been endless, Emma drawing but never speaking, therapists explaining she needed to process, that time would heal, that patience and professional care would eventually break through, but nothing worked, nothing changed. 3 years passing while his daughter lived in silence and William lived in guilt, and both of them existed in separate prisons built from the same tragedy. Security footage from the grocery store showed Emma walking past dozens of people, William explained. Families and elderly shoppers and store employees. But she stopped only for Daniel. Somehow she recognized him, or recognized something in him. Some echo of her mother, or the symbol or the connection she had been seeking since the screen went dark. Emma needed to find someone who was there, who tried, who could tell her the truth about her mother's death. William said, his voice breaking completely now. She has been looking for you for 3 years. She needed to know Sarah was not alone, that someone cared, that the Guardians really tried even if they could not win. Daniel pulled a small box from his jacket pocket then, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. Inside was Sarah's bracelet, the metal tarnished but intact, Emma's name still visible, the Guardian charm still attached. Kept safe for 3 years by a man who did not deserve to carry it, but could not let it go. Emma gasped audibly, the first clear sound since her small vocalization in the grocery store. Her hands reaching for the bracelet with desperate need, recognizing her childhood gift, the protection she had tried to give her mother, the symbol that had failed to keep its promise. She held the bracelet against her chest, and her lips began moving, sound forming for the first time in 3 years. Words struggling to break through layers of silence and trauma and fear, and finally in a whisper so quiet they had to lean in to hear, Emma asked the question that had lived in her for 1,000 days. Did Mommy hurt? And Daniel knew that every moment since Syria, every choice, every failure, every morning he woke up had been leading to this, to answering this question for this child, to giving her the one truth he could offer in a world that had given her nothing but lies and loss and silence that screamed louder than words ever could. William insisted on meeting Mia the very next day, his voice carrying a desperation that Daniel recognized because it mirrored his own, a need to understand the full picture of the man who had been with Sarah in her final moments. But Daniel resisted at first, his pride creating walls around the poverty he had worked so hard to dignify through sheer determination and love. Emma would not let him refuse, her small hand gripping his with surprising strength, tugging him toward the decision he was afraid to make. And Daniel realized she had not let go of his hand since the coffee shop, as if releasing him might make him disappear like smoke, like her mother, like everything good that had ever touched her life. They arrived at Daniel's apartment building in William's luxury sedan. The vehicle looking absurd, parked between dented sedans and rusted trucks. The contrast so stark, it made Daniel's chest tighten with shame he had no right to feel, but carried anyway. The apartment was tiny, a cramped 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades, the walls thin enough to hear neighbors arguing and the plumbing that groaned like an old man climbing stairs. But it was clean, meticulously so, because Daniel believed that poverty was not an excuse for disorder, that dignity lived in the small choices people made when no one was watching. Mia's medical equipment occupied one corner of the living room, an IV stand, an oxygen tank, and rolling cart full of medications with names too long to pronounce. But the walls were covered in her drawings, bright, cheerful explosions of color that transformed the peeling paint beneath into something that felt like hope. Mia appeared from her bedroom wearing a bright yellow headscarf over her bald head, her face lighting up with the kind of joy that seemed impossible for someone fighting a battle most adults could not endure, and she practically bounced across the room despite her obvious fatigue, her voice ringing out with pure excitement as she said, "I am Mia. Are you Emma? Dad said you might visit. Do you like to draw? I love your rabbit." Emma nodded, a small smile appearing on her face, the first smile William had seen in 3 years that reached her eyes and made her look like the child she used to be. And she sat beside Mia on the worn couch, pulling out her sketchbook with careful reverence. Mia chattered away, talking enough for both of them, showing Emma her art supplies, which were modest but well-loved. Crayons worn down to nubs and markers with dried-out tips and paper that was cheap but abundant, and she never mentioned her medical equipment or her illness, just dove straight into the business of being children together. 2 souls recognizing something essential in each other that adults spent lifetimes failing to see. William stood in the doorway watching this unfold. His trained eye catching details Daniel wished he could hide. The overdue bills stacked on the kitchen counter, weighted down by a coffee mug, the medication schedule taped to the refrigerator, with times written in military precision. The apartment that was clean and loved, but unmistakably the home of someone hanging on by financial fingernails. Understanding dawned across William's face. The realization that Daniel was not just working class but actively struggling, that every shift at the grocery store was a calculation between rent and medicine, between food and treatment, between today and the uncertain promise of tomorrow. The girls bonded with the speed of children who understood suffering without needing to discuss it. Emma drawing pictures for Mia, beautiful, hopeful images of flowers and birds and sunshine, while Mia narrated elaborate stories about each one, her imagination transforming simple sketches into epic adventures. William cleared his throat and spoke carefully. His words measured like a man negotiating a treaty. If you need help with expenses or medical bills or anything at all, I have resources. I would be happy to. But Daniel cut him off with quiet firmness. His voice gentle but unyielding. We are managing fine, but thank you. The words containing all the dignity of a man who had lost almost everything except his right to stand on his own 2 feet. William felt frustration rise in him, the familiar sensation of being able to solve problems with money, but being told the solution was unwelcome. Unable to understand why pride mattered more than practicality, why Daniel would choose struggle over acceptance when a simple signature could transform their lives. Emma seemed more alive than William had seen her in 3 years, refusing to leave Mia's side even when he suggested they should go. Clinging to this connection like a drowning person clings to driftwood, and William realized his daughter had found something in this cramped apartment that his penthouse could never provide. Someone who understood loss without needing explanations. Someone who lived with uncertainty as a constant companion. Someone real. The next invitation came from William, his voice almost begging as he asked them to visit his home, to have dinner, to let him return the hospitality in some small way, and Mia's excitement was so palpable that Daniel could not refuse, even though every instinct told him crossing into William's world would highlight exactly how far apart their lives really were. The penthouse took Mia's breath away, her eyes growing wide as they rode the private elevator up 47 floors, her amazement pure and unself-conscious as she pressed her face against the glass and watched the city shrink below them. The apartment was everything Daniel expected and feared. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering skyline. Marble floors so polished they reflected light like mirrors, an art collection that probably cost more than Daniel would earn in 10 lifetimes. Furniture that looked too expensive to sit on, and a kitchen that belonged in a restaurant rather than a home. Emma gave Mia a tour, showing her bedroom that was bigger than Daniel's entire apartment, filled with toys that had never been played with, stuffed animals still bearing price tags, games in unopened boxes, a child's paradise that felt more like a showroom than a sanctuary. Mia's joy was infectious, though, her enthusiasm transforming the sterile space into something that felt warmer, her voice echoing through rooms that rarely heard laughter as she exclaimed over every marvel. Dinner was prepared by a professional chef, served in a formal dining room with place settings that had more forks than Daniel knew what to do with, and both he and Mia felt overwhelmed, out of place, like actors who had wandered onto the wrong stage and forgotten their lines. William was stiff with formality at first, years of business dinners and corporate events making casual conversation feel foreign, while Daniel sat uncomfortably in a chair that probably cost more than his monthly rent, and the girls chattered between them, Mia talking and Emma nodding, a strange duet of sound and silence that somehow worked. Mia said something then that changed the entire evening, her voice cutting through the awkwardness with childlike honesty. Your house is really pretty, but it feels lonely, like nobody laughs here. And William's composure cracked, his carefully maintained mask slipping as he asked, "How did you know I am lonely?" Mia's wisdom came from a place beyond her 8 years, forged in hospital rooms and midnight fears, and the understanding that came from staring at mortality. My dad says lonely is when your house does not feel like home. You need more drawings on the fridge. And the simple truth of it hit William like a physical blow. He began to open up then, the words spilling out in a torrent he could not control, talking about Sarah's death and his failure as a father, and how his business success felt meaningless when measured against the silence of his daughter, how he was terrified of losing Emma forever, how he did not know how to build a bridge across 3 years of mutual grief. Daniel shared his own fears in return, his voice quiet but steady, talking about Mia's illness and the constant anxiety that lived in his chest like a stone, about being scared every time the phone rang that it would be the hospital with bad news, about feeling helpless in the face of cancer that did not care about love or determination or how much a father was willing to sacrifice. Being scared means you love them, Daniel said, his words simple but profound. That is strength, not weakness. And William felt something shift inside him, some tightly wound spring beginning to loosen. Emma did something then that made time stop. She climbed down from her chair and walked to her father, climbed into his lap unprompted for the first time in 3 years, and laid her head on his chest like she used to do when she was small and the world was safe and her mother was still alive. William broke, his tears coming in great heaving sobs, holding his daughter, while years of accumulated grief flowed out of him. And Daniel and Mia witnessed this healing with quiet reverence, understanding they were seeing something sacred, something that could not be rushed or forced, only honored. The 4 of them became something more than strangers that night, not quite family yet, but moving in that direction. 4 damaged people finding in each other's brokenness the possibility of wholeness. 2 weeks later, William arranged for Emma to have a therapy session, but requested Daniel attend, Emma insisting on his presence with the few words she was speaking now, mostly whispers directed only at her father and Daniel and Mia. Trust growing slowly like a plant in difficult soil. The breakthrough came through art, Emma drawing guardian symbols as she always did, but this time placing faces inside them. Daniel's face and Sarah's face and William's face, each contained within separate symbols, and the therapist understood immediately what Emma had been searching for all along. Emma had been looking for guardians, the therapist explained. People who protect unconditionally, who stand between the innocent and harm, who choose to stay when leaving would be easier, and she needed to know her father was one too. Needed confirmation that she had not lost all her protectors when her mother died. Emma's silence had been about preservation, the therapist continued. She stopped speaking to keep her mother's memory intact, afraid that talking about Sarah would make the memories fade, that words would somehow diminish what pictures and silence kept sacred. Daniel's role had been to prove Sarah was loved and protected, to validate her mother's bravery, to give meaning to a death that seemed meaningless, to answer questions no one else could answer because no one else was there. Daniel knelt to Emma's level then, taking her small hands in his scarred ones, and told her the truth she needed to hear. Your mother's last word was your name. She smiled when she said it. She thought of you. She was not afraid. And Emma absorbed these words like water after years of drought. Tears fell silently down Emma's face as she nodded, processing 3 years of confusion and grief and unanswered questions. And then she whispered so quietly they had to lean in to hear, "Thank you." And the room froze, William gasping, the therapist stunned, Daniel's eyes filling with tears of his own. Emma continued, her voice stronger now, looking directly at Daniel with trust that felt like a sacred responsibility. "Will you be my guardian too?" And Daniel's voice broke as he answered, "I already am. I will always try to protect you. That is what guardians do." Over the following weeks, Emma's voice grew stronger, speaking in whispers to her small circle, trust slowly expanding. And the 2 families met constantly. Dinners and park trips and movie nights, an unconventional unit forming from the wreckage of separate tragedies. Emma was speaking regularly now, still quiet but engaged, laughing and playing and remembering her mother with joy instead of only pain. And Mia was always beside her, 2 girls becoming sisters in every way that mattered beyond blood and paperwork. Daniel hid his new fear well. The latest test results showing Mia's leukemia was progressing despite treatment. The numbers moving in the wrong direction, the window for the experimental therapy closing like a door he could not afford to open. But he smiled for his daughter, and Emma and William kept his terror private, calculated impossible mathematics in the middle of the night while everyone else slept, trying to find a solution where none existed except the one his pride would not let him accept.